U.S. Delta Force saw the old veteran cleaning his rifle, then froze when reading the engraving. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's tale. In the middle of a dusty, desolate base in the middle of the desert, where the sun beat down relentlessly, a group of young Delta Force operators were gathered, going through their routine maintenance. The air was heavy with the smell of sweat, metal, and gun oil, the kind of scent that told a soldier it was time for the daily grind. A weathered old man sat at the edge of the base, quietly tending to his rifle. His hands moved with practiced precision, wiping down the barrel and checking the sights as if this was the most important thing in the world. The soldiers didn't pay him much attention at first. He was just an old man, one of those veterans who hung around the base. They assumed he was harmless, nothing more than a relic of a bygone era. They couldn't have been more wrong. As the soldiers laughed and joked amongst themselves, one of the young operators, a cocky kid named Grant, snickered at the sight of the old man. "What's he doing? Cleaning his rifle like it's some kind of treasure," he muttered under his breath, his voice laced with sarcasm. Another soldier, Mitch, joined in. "Yeah, like he's got any idea how to use that thing." They all laughed, but the old man didn't react. His focus remained on the rifle in his hands, as if the noise around him didn't even exist. Grant, feeling a little bolder, walked over to the old man, standing a few feet away, looking down at him with disdain. "Hey, old man, you still know how to use that thing? Or is it just for show?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. The old man didn't look up, didn't acknowledge Grant's presence at all. He just kept cleaning the rifle, every movement deliberate, every gesture practiced. The soldiers around them exchanged glances, a few of them snickering quietly at the situation. The young Delta operator leaned in closer, peering over the old man's shoulder. "What? You a collector or something?" he asked again, this time louder. Still, the veteran didn't respond. But something about the way the old man held the rifle, the way his hands moved with such care, caught Grant's attention. For a brief moment, the younger soldier felt something stir in his chest, a sense that maybe he was looking at more than just an old man. Then, as if on cue, the old man stopped what he was doing and looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting Grant's. For the first time, Grant felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something unsettling in those eyes, something that spoke of experience, of a life lived far beyond the confines of the base. But before he could say another word, the old man spoke in a quiet, calm voice. "The rifle's more than just a weapon, son. It's a piece of history. A piece of my history." He didn't elaborate, but the weight of his words hung in the air, thick and heavy. The laughter from the other soldiers died down. They didn't know it yet, but this was the moment that would change everything. Something about the old man's presence had shifted. His silence, his calm, had a weight that none of them could ignore. And just as the tension began to build, something else caught their eye, the engraving on the side of the rifle. A small, faded inscription that none of them had noticed before. "What's that?" Grant asked, squinting at the marking. The others leaned in closer, trying to make out the words. As the engraving came into focus, their expressions changed from confusion to disbelief. It wasn't just any rifle. It wasn't just any veteran. This was a man with a history, a man who had seen things, done things that none of them could ever imagine. The old man didn't need to say another word. His eyes spoke volumes. And just like that, the young operators fell silent. The weight of the moment had arrived. The rifle, the engraving, the man, it was all part of a story they couldn't have fathomed. It was a story they were about to learn the hard way. This old veteran, once dismissed as a relic, was someone they would never forget. The moment hung in the air like a cloud waiting to burst. The engraving on the rifle was no longer just a detail. It was a key to something much larger, something that none of the young soldiers standing around could comprehend. Grant, the most outspoken of them all, was the first to break the silence. He leaned in closer, squinting at the engraving as if willing the words to make sense. His mind raced, trying to place the significance of the inscription, but the letters remained foreign to him. The other soldiers were equally bewildered, their eyes flicking between the engraving and the old man. They had underestimated him, and they knew it. Mitch, standing next to Grant, was the next to speak, though his voice lacked the usual arrogance. "What is this?" he asked, his words barely a whisper. The old man, still seated, slowly raised his eyes from the rifle and met Mitch's gaze. His voice was calm, steady, but it carried an authority that made Mitch take an involuntary step back. "That rifle," the old man began, "has been through more than any of you could imagine. It's seen battles, saved lives, and it's been a part of me ever since the day I first held it." The soldiers exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. They had expected the old man to dismiss them, to tell them to mind their business. But instead, they were confronted with a story, one that was both humbling and terrifying. The old man's eyes seemed to pierce through them, as if he were seeing something beyond the base, beyond the present moment, into a time long past. "That engraving," he continued, "was given to me by a man who owes me a debt he could never repay." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a history the soldiers couldn't begin to fathom. Grant, now feeling uneasy, took a step back and looked at his comrades. "What's he talking about?" he muttered, but the old man didn't respond. Instead, he stood up slowly, as if every movement required careful thought. His joints creaked, his back slightly hunched, but there was a quiet strength in his presence that sent a chill through the group. "I didn't just fight in wars," the old man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I saved lives. I carried men off the battlefield, through hell, through blood and fire. And I did it because it was my duty." As he spoke, his tone shifted. He was no longer just an old man with a rifle. He was a legend, someone who had lived through the unthinkable. The silence was suffocating, and the young soldiers, for the first time, felt the weight of their arrogance. The old man was no longer the figure of ridicule they had dismissed earlier. He was a force, a presence that commanded respect. Grant, still unsure of what to make of the situation, glanced at his rifle and then at the old man. His thoughts raced, memories of stories from veterans he had heard over the years. But none of them prepared him for this moment. He was face to face with a living legend, someone who had lived a life far beyond the stories. Without saying another word, the old man placed the rifle back in its case and stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. As he did, the soldiers couldn't help but notice the small tattoo on his wrist, the same symbol that was etched into the rifle. It was a symbol of a unit long since disbanded, a symbol of men who had fought and bled together. A symbol of honor, a symbol of sacrifice. "You think you know what it means to be a soldier," the old man said, his voice now filled with a quiet authority. "But you don't. You haven't earned it. You haven't seen the things I've seen." The words hung in the air, each one landing with the force of a punch. Grant's confidence faltered as the old man's presence overwhelmed him. He had no response, no comeback, no joke, just the overwhelming realization that he had been wrong. The soldiers, all of them, stood in silence, not daring to speak, not daring to move. The old man turned and walked away, leaving them with nothing but the weight of his words and the quiet hum of the bass. It was a moment they would never forget, a moment when they learned that respect isn't earned through arrogance, but through sacrifice and honor. The engraving on the rifle, the tattoo on his wrist, these were more than just symbols. They were reminders. Reminders that legends walk among us, disguised, in the most unassuming of forms. The silence lingered for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the soft hum of the base's machinery in the background. Grant, Mitch, and the rest of the Delta Force team stood motionless, their eyes still locked on the old man as he walked away. The events of the past few minutes had shattered the confident facade they had once worn so easily. They were no longer just a group of young soldiers. They were witnesses to something far greater than their limited experiences. As the old man disappeared into the distance, Grant couldn't shake the feeling that they had all missed something crucial, something that they had only begun to understand. He had made a mistake, and it wasn't something that could be easily fixed. "What just happened?" Mitch muttered under his breath, his voice a mixture of confusion and respect. The others were silent, still processing the gravity of the moment. They had all thought the old man was just another relic, another forgotten veteran. But now, with the engraving on the rifle and the tattoo on his wrist, they knew better. The man they had dismissed so easily had lived through battles, through hardships, and through victories that they could only dream of. Grant shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of his previous arrogance pressing down on him. He had always been confident, always quick to judge. But this was different. The old man had revealed a side of himself that none of them had expected, a side that demanded respect. Who was he? Grant asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What's his story? Mitch looked at him, his expression serious. I don't know, but I feel like we need to find out. The team agreed, each of them sensing that the old man's story was far from over. And so, the next day, they set out to learn more. They approached the base's command center, hoping to get some answers. After some time, they were directed to a small office, where an older officer sat at a desk, his face creased with years of service. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect. When they asked about the old man, the officer's expression changed. It was subtle, but it was enough to tell them that they were about to hear something important. You want to know about him? The officer asked, leaning forward slightly. His name is John Miller. He was one of the most decorated soldiers in history, but you won't find his name in the history books. The team was silent, hanging on every word. The officer continued. Miller was part of an elite unit during the Vietnam War, a unit so secret that it was erased from the records after the war ended. He didn't want the fame, didn't care for the recognition. His only concern was the men he saved, the lives he brought home. Grant and Mitch exchanged glances, both stunned by what they were hearing. They had never heard of John Miller before, but it was clear that his legacy was more than just a name. It was a symbol of sacrifice, of duty, and of honor. The officer continued, his voice tinged with reverence. He was known as the shepherd. He went into places that no one else dared to go. He rescued men who were left for dead, brought them back from the edge of death. He never asked for anything in return. Not a medal, not a promotion, nothing. He said the only reward he needed was seeing his men alive and well. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. But why the secrecy? Grant asked, still trying to wrap his head around the magnitude of what they were hearing. Why didn't anyone know about him? The officer sighed, a look of sadness crossing his face. Because Miller didn't want anyone to know. He didn't want the recognition. He didn't want the fame. He just wanted to live out his life in peace. But the truth is, he's a living legend. And even though the world didn't know it, those of us who served with him will never forget. The room was quiet for a moment as the weight of the officer's words sank in. Grant and Mitch stood there, their minds racing, trying to understand how they had failed to see the man for who he truly was. They had laughed, mocked, and underestimated him, and in doing so, they had dishonored the very thing they claimed to protect. The officer's voice broke through their thoughts. You'll never meet another man like John Miller. You've just had a glimpse of who he is. And if you ever meet him again, show him the respect he deserves. With that, the conversation ended. The team left the office, their minds heavy with the truth they had uncovered. The old man, John Miller, was more than just a soldier. He was a legend, a man who had lived a life of unimaginable courage and sacrifice. And they, the young soldiers, had learned a valuable lesson. Respect is earned through action, not words, and the true heroes are often the ones we least expect. The following day, Grant, Mitch, and the rest of the Delta Force team gathered in their usual training area, but the atmosphere was far from normal. The weight of their recent discovery hung heavily over them, and no one spoke. The old man, John Miller, had unknowingly shattered their perceptions, and now they were left with questions, feelings of shame, and an unspoken desire to do right by him. The lesson they had learned was hard to digest. Grant, still processing what they had heard from the officer the day before, couldn't shake the feeling that they had missed out on something extraordinary. They had treated John Miller like a relic, and in doing so, had dishonored him. He had lived a life few could even imagine, and here they were, young and naive, thinking they knew it all. We need to find him, Grant said quietly, breaking the silence. We need to apologize. We need to make things right. Mitch, who had been staring off into the distance, nodded in agreement. Yeah, but how do we even begin? We treated him like a joke. Grant clenched his fists, frustration creeping up his spine. We start by showing him the respect he deserves. And we don't just apologize. We show him that we understand. We get it. Mitch didn't respond, but the others nodded. The team had all been thinking the same thing. They had a mission now, one that had nothing to do with combat or strategy. It was a mission of respect, of redemption. And they weren't going to fail. Hours later, the team gathered near the base's barracks, hoping to catch a glimpse of John Miller. They knew he didn't stay at the base, but they had learned enough to know where he went. He was always in the same spot, cleaning his rifle, just as he had the day before. It was a quiet, meditative process for him. As they approached, they saw him sitting alone, the sun beginning to dip behind the horizon. His posture was unchanged, his focus on the rifle in front of him. The sight of him brought a sense of humility to the young soldiers, a feeling they hadn't expected. They had been prepared to approach him with an apology, but now, seeing him in his quiet solitude, they realized that words alone might not be enough. They needed to show him something more. Grant stepped forward, taking the lead. "Sir," he began, his voice steady, though tinged with respect. "We've come to apologize. For the way we treated you, for the things we said. We were wrong. You deserve far more respect than we gave you." John Miller didn't look up. His hands continued to work methodically on the rifle, the same calm demeanor he had shown earlier. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't need your apology," he said softly, his voice rough but clear. "What I need is for you to understand." The words hit like a wave crashing against the shore, leaving the soldiers stunned. They hadn't expected such a response, but it was exactly what they needed to hear. "You think you know what it means to be a soldier," John continued, his hands never stopping their careful work. "But the truth is, you don't. You've got to live it. You've got to put everything on the line, every day. And you have to be willing to leave it all behind if that's what it takes." Grant swallowed hard, his throat dry. "We understand now," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his realization. "We just didn't get it before. But we do now. And we're going to prove it to you." John Miller finally looked up, his eyes meeting Grant's. The two men stood there for a moment, locked in a quiet understanding. It wasn't a moment of grand gestures or speeches. It was a moment of silent acknowledgement, a moment where the weight of their shared experiences was enough. "I don't need proving," John said, his voice low but firm. "You just need to live with honor. And that's all I'll ask of you." With that, he stood up, slowly, as if every movement was measured with care. He didn't make a show of his actions. There were no grand words, no heroic displays. Just a simple man, doing what he had done for years, living with dignity. Grant and the team stood quietly, watching as the old man walked away, his rifle cradled in his hands. For the first time, they understood the true meaning of honor. It wasn't about medals or accolades. It wasn't about the recognition that came from others. It was about living with integrity, staying true to your values, and respecting the lives around you. As they watched him disappear into the distance, they knew that they had just been given a lesson they would carry with them forever, and they weren't about to forget it. Days passed since their encounter with John Miller, but for Grant and the rest of the Delta Force team, the feeling of being forever changed lingered in the air, thick and undeniable. The old man's words echoed in their minds, and each of them reflected on how they had misunderstood him, underestimated him. They had walked past a legend, not even realizing it. Now, they knew better. They had learned a lesson about respect that would shape their future in ways they hadn't fully grasped yet. It was late in the afternoon when Grant decided it was time to take action. He had thought about nothing else since the meeting with John Miller. There was something more he had to do, something that could bring closure to what had been left unsaid. He called a team meeting. As the team gathered in the common room, Grant stood at the front, his face serious. "We've all been thinking about what happened with the old man," he began, his voice steady. "And we all know we've got some making up to do. But there's something else." The room fell silent, all eyes on him. "We're going to go out there," he continued, "and we're going to honor him. Not just with words, but with our actions. He deserves that much." Mitch, who had been quiet for days, nodded slowly. "You mean, we go find him?" he asked. "Yes," Grant replied. "We've got the man's respect. Now, it's time to give him what he's earned. We're going to take him to the memorial, and we're going to show him the respect he deserves." The rest of the team agreed without hesitation. It wasn't just about making amends. It was about doing what was right. They knew it wasn't going to be easy. They didn't know exactly where to find John Miller, but they knew enough about his habits, his routine. He spent most of his time near the edge of the base, away from the crowd, keeping to himself. He was a man of solitude, of quiet dignity. They gathered their gear and set out, walking in silence as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the base. They made their way to the area where they had first encountered John Miller. There, in the distance, they saw him. He was sitting on a bench, his rifle beside him, looking out toward the horizon. The team approached slowly, carefully, as though afraid to disturb the fragile moment of peace he had carved out for himself. Grant stepped forward. "Sir," he called out, his voice filled with the respect he now felt. "We came to see you." John Miller didn't immediately look up. He simply nodded, acknowledging their presence. "I figured you might," he said softly. "Did you come to apologize again?" Grant shook his head. "No, sir. We came to honor you." The old man's eyes finally met Grant's, his expression unreadable. The soldier stood there, waiting for his response. For a long moment, there was silence. And then John Miller slowly stood up, the weight of his years reflected in the careful way he moved. "Honor's something that's earned," he said quietly. "It's not something you give because you feel guilty. It's not something you take. It's something you live by." Grant swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. "We understand that now," he said. "But we want to show you how much we've learned. We want to take you to the memorial. We want you to see how much we respect you." John Miller didn't speak for a moment. His eyes seemed to search Grant's face, as if weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said, his voice soft but firm. "If that's what you want." The group set off toward the memorial, walking in a quiet procession. As they approached, the soldiers could feel the weight of the place, the silent reverence that hung in the air, the history embedded in the stone, and the names carved into it. John Miller stopped at the base of the memorial, his eyes scanning the names of those who had come before. For a moment, it seemed as if the world stood still. "This is where we're remembered," he said quietly. "Not for the medals we earned, not for the glory we were supposed to get, but for the lives we saved, for the people we brought home." The words hit Grant like a hammer. They had always thought of themselves as soldiers, but they had never understood what it meant to truly be one. They had been looking for recognition for the wrong reasons. It wasn't about medals or honor. It was about the lives they touched, the people they saved. As they stood there, paying their respects to the fallen, something shifted inside each of them. They understood now that the real heroes, the ones who had truly earned respect, were often the ones who didn't seek it. John Miller was one of those heroes, and they would carry his lesson with them forever. Weeks passed since the team had visited the memorial with John Miller, but the lessons they had learned from him still lingered in their minds. Grant and the others couldn't shake the realization that they had come so close to ignoring someone who had lived a life far more extraordinary than they could ever imagine. It wasn't just about the medals, the achievements, or the honors. It was about what a man could do for his comrades, for his country, without ever seeking recognition. John Miller had shown them that true heroism didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops. It wasn't about the glory. It was about the people you saved, the lives you touched, and the respect you earned through action, not words. One evening, Grant found himself staring at his rifle, just like the old man had done so many times before. He realized that this was his turning point. He had always thought of himself as a soldier, but now he understood what it truly meant to be one. The pressure to be recognized, the desire for validation, all seemed so trivial now. He had learned that the true measure of a soldier was not the accolades they received, but the integrity they maintained. As the weeks wore on, the team continued their training, but their approach had changed. They were no longer the same group of cocky young soldiers who thought they had all the answers. Now, they understood the weight of their duty. They were no longer just warriors. They were men who had learned to respect the sacrifices of those who came before them. It was during one of their late-night drills that they were called into a briefing by their commanding officer. The urgency in the officer's tone immediately grabbed their attention. "We've got a mission," the officer said, his face grim. "There's an operation going down in a few hours, and we need to be ready." Grant's heart raced. He had been anticipating something like this. A real mission, a real test. The kind of thing that would show them if they had truly learned from the lessons they had been given. The team suited up, their minds focused and their hearts steady. They had been trained for moments like this, but this time, it felt different. They weren't just going out to complete a mission. They were going to do it with the kind of respect and honor that John Miller had instilled in them. As they deployed, the air was thick with tension. They moved swiftly through the dense brush, the only sound being the crunch of their boots on the dry earth. The mission was clear, but it was also dangerous. They were to infiltrate a compound, retrieve vital intelligence, and extract without being detected. Every move had to be calculated, every step deliberate. They approached the target area with caution, their senses heightened. The team worked in unison, the bond they shared growing stronger with each step. They had become a family, not just through training but through the shared understanding that honor and respect were the true foundations of their strength. As they neared the compound, the team split into smaller units, each one taking their position. Grant led one group, Mitch another. The plan was simple: move in, get the intel, and get out. But nothing in their line of work was ever simple. They made their way into the compound, silent as shadows, their movements precise. Grant's heart pounded in his chest, but he felt no fear, only focus. This wasn't just another operation. This was a chance to prove to themselves that they had grown, that they had learned from the best. As they entered the main building, they encountered resistance. It was a small but well-armed group that stood between them and their objective. The team moved quickly, efficiently, taking out the guards one by one with silent precision. No hesitation, no room for error. They were doing it, living up to the values they had learned from the old man, from John Miller. They reached the target room and quickly retrieved the intelligence they needed. But as they turned to leave, a loud noise echoed through the hallway. An alarm had been triggered. "Move!" Grant shouted. The team sprang into action, rushing toward the exit. They were close, so close, but they knew time was running out. The sound of footsteps grew louder, signaling that they were being pursued. The extraction point was in sight. Just as they reached the final stretch, they encountered one last obstacle: a group of enemy soldiers blocking their path. This was it. Grant looked around, his mind racing, but there was no time to think. He nodded to Mitch, who signaled the rest of the team. With coordinated precision, they neutralized the threat, each movement a perfect reflection of their training and their newfound understanding of honor and respect. They made it to the extraction point, breathless but triumphant. As the helicopter lifted off, Grant looked out over the compound below. They had done it, not just because they were good soldiers, but because they had learned what it meant to be great men. They had honored the lessons they had been taught, and they had earned their place as soldiers. The mission was a success, but more than that, it was a personal victory. A victory that would stay with them forever. As the weeks went by, the team's newfound respect for John Miller and the lessons he had instilled in them continued to shape their lives in ways they hadn't expected. Their training remained as rigorous as ever, but now, there was a different energy in the air. They were no longer just soldiers focused on combat and missions. They had become men of integrity, carrying the weight of their duty with a newfound sense of responsibility. They had learned what it truly meant to honor their comrades, and the bond they shared had grown stronger. But as time passed, there was a growing realization that their journey with John Miller wasn't over. They had only scratched the surface of his story, and the more they thought about it, the more they realized there was much more to learn. Grant, in particular, couldn't shake the feeling that they needed to know more about the man who had taught them so much in so little time. One evening, after a grueling training session, Grant sat down in the team's common room, his mind racing. Mitch, noticing his serious expression, walked over and sat down beside him. "What's on your mind?" Mitch asked. Grant looked at him, his eyes filled with purpose. "We need to find out more about him. About John Miller. I can't shake the feeling that there's more to his story. More that we need to understand." Mitch nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been feeling the same way. The man's a legend, but he doesn't act like one. It's like there's something he's not telling us." Grant leaned forward, his voice low. "We need to learn about his past. Not just the stuff we've been told, but the real story. We owe him that much." The team agreed, and over the next few days, they set out to gather more information. They spoke to other veterans, searched through archives, and dug into the history of the mysterious unit Miller had been part of. What they discovered left them in awe. John Miller had been part of an elite, classified unit during the Vietnam War, one that had performed missions so dangerous and secret that they had been erased from official records. The things Miller had done, the lives he had saved, were stories only whispered about by those who had been there. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a hero whose actions had shaped the course of history, but who had never sought recognition. As they pieced together the story of his past, they learned about his role in rescuing downed pilots, his harrowing missions behind enemy lines, and his ability to get the job done when no one else could. It became clear that John Miller's reputation as the shepherd wasn't just a nickname. It was a title earned through years of sacrifice, bravery, and selflessness. Grant couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration. The man he had once dismissed as just another old veteran was, in reality, a living testament to the power of quiet leadership and unwavering dedication. But there was something else they discovered, something even more profound. They learned that John Miller had walked away from it all. After years of serving his country in the most dangerous ways imaginable, he had chosen to live a life of solitude, away from the fame and recognition that others would have chased. He had no desire for accolades, no need for the world to know his name. He had done it all for one reason: to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And once he had done that, once he had given everything he had, he stepped away, leaving behind a legacy that few would ever fully understand. It was this revelation that struck Grant the hardest. He realized that Miller wasn't just a soldier. He was a symbol of everything the team had been striving to become. He was everything they had been trained to be, but with one key difference. Miller had done it without any expectation of reward. He had done it because it was right. The team knew they couldn't just admire him from afar. They had to live up to his example. They had to embody the lessons he had taught them. They had to continue his legacy in their own way, not through medals or glory, but through the quiet actions that defined true strength. It was then that Grant made a decision. They would invite John Miller to be a part of their team, not just as a mentor, but as a brother. They knew he would never ask for it, but they also knew that the honor of having him with them would elevate their purpose to something greater. As they prepared for their next mission, the team felt a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were men who had learned the true meaning of sacrifice and integrity, and they were ready to prove it. They would carry John Miller's lessons with them, no matter where the battlefield took them. It wasn't about the victories they achieved or the enemies they defeated. It was about how they carried themselves and how they respected the legacy of those who had come before them. They were ready, and when the time came, they would make John Miller proud. It had been weeks since the mission, and Grant and his team had not only grown as soldiers, but as men. The lessons learned from John Miller had settled deep within them, changing the way they approached not only their work, but their lives. They had come to understand that true strength wasn't about being the loudest, the toughest, or the fastest. It was about humility, sacrifice, and living with integrity. John Miller had become more than just a mentor to them. He had become a symbol of what they aspired to be. But even after all they had learned, there was still something missing, something they had yet to truly experience. As their next mission approached, the team gathered in the briefing room, ready for what was to come. But this time, they weren't just there to receive orders. They had a purpose beyond the mission ahead of them. They had a goal: to make sure that John Miller knew just how much they appreciated him. They were going to show him the respect he deserved, not just as a soldier, but as a man who had shaped their very understanding of honor. "This mission's going to be tough," Grant began, addressing his team. "But there's something more we need to do. We're going to ask John Miller to join us, officially. I know he'll never ask for it, but we need him on our team. Not as a mentor, but as a brother." The room was quiet. The team had grown close over the past few months, and they understood what this meant. It wasn't just about getting the job done. It was about honoring a man who had done far more for them than any of them could fully comprehend. "He's earned that place," Mitch said, his voice steady. "He's shown us what it means to be a soldier, to be a man of honor. We can't just keep looking up to him from a distance. We need him with us." The rest of the team agreed, each of them feeling the same deep respect for John Miller. They had learned from him, but now they wanted to be his equal. As they prepared for the mission ahead, Grant felt a sense of peace. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but the idea of working alongside Miller as a true teammate gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. The mission itself was a standard operation, one that involved infiltrating a high-value target's compound and gathering intelligence on an impending threat. It wasn't their first time dealing with these types of operations, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't just about neutralizing the threat. It was about proving to themselves that they could live up to the lessons they had learned. As they arrived at the target location, the team split into their usual teams and began their approach. Grant and Mitch led the first group, moving swiftly and silently through the darkened terrain. The others followed closely behind, their movements synchronized and smooth. There was no hesitation, no room for error. They had worked together countless times, but this time, they felt more united than ever. They approached the compound with caution, staying in the shadows, moving like ghosts. The tension was palpable, but the team's focus was unshakable. They reached the target building and began their search for the intelligence they needed. The operation was going smoothly until they encountered an unexpected obstacle, a group of heavily armed guards. The situation escalated quickly, and the team found themselves in a dangerous standoff. The team remained calm, the training kicking in as they methodically neutralized the threat. But there was something different about this mission. It wasn't just the adrenaline or the danger that made their hearts race. It was the knowledge that they were doing this for something bigger than themselves. They weren't just soldiers on a mission. They were living out the values John Miller had taught them. They were fighting not for glory, but for respect, for honor, and for the men who had shown them what it meant to be true soldiers. After dealing with the guards, the team made their way to the central control room where they found the intelligence they needed. They gathered the data and moved quickly to the extraction point. The mission was nearly over, but as they moved through the compound, they encountered one final challenge, an unexpected ambush. The team fought back fiercely, but this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about proving they had learned from the best. They held their ground, fighting with everything they had, remembering what John Miller had taught them. That strength wasn't just about physical power. It was about staying true to your principles, even when the odds were against you. Finally, the extraction team arrived, and the mission was completed successfully. As the helicopter lifted off, Grant looked out over the compound below. The team had done it. Not just because they were the best trained, not just because they had the skills, but because they had become the kind of men who earned respect through their actions, not their words. As they flew back to base, Grant knew that this mission had been a turning point. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were men who had earned their place, not through medals or recognition, but through the quiet strength of their integrity. And in that moment, Grant knew that the lessons they had learned from John Miller would stay with them forever. The team was back at base after their successful mission, but the sense of accomplishment was different this time. Grant, Mitch, and the others felt a quiet pride, not in the operation they had just completed, but in something much deeper. They had learned something more valuable than any mission brief or tactical strategy could teach. They had learned the true meaning of honor, respect, and sacrifice, lessons that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. As they sat in the common room, decompressing from the mission, Grant couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. Not just as soldiers, but as men. They were no longer the same group of cocky young recruits who had once walked onto the base thinking they had all the answers. Now, they understood the weight of what it meant to be a soldier. They understood that strength didn't come from physical prowess alone, but from integrity, humility, and an unwavering commitment to something greater than oneself. Mitch was the first to break the silence. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I don't think any of us expected to learn what we did." "I know I didn't." Grant nodded, looking around at the rest of the team. "I think we all owe John Miller more than we could ever repay. He didn't just teach us how to fight. He taught us how to live, how to be men of honor, not just soldiers." The room was still, the team taking in Grant's words. They had all felt it, that shift in their perspective, that change in the way they saw the world. The mission had been tough, but the real challenge had been learning from a man who had lived a life none of them could truly understand, yet had touched each of them in a way they would never forget. As the days passed, the team continued their training, but now there was a different focus. They didn't just train to be the best. They trained to be the kind of men who earned respect through their actions. And each day, they worked to become more like the hero they had come to admire. It wasn't about the recognition or the accolades. It was about making a difference. It was about living with integrity and always doing what was right, even when no one was watching. One day, after a particularly grueling training session, the team gathered together again. But this time, it wasn't just for a debriefing. They had something important to discuss. "We've been talking," Grant began, "and we all agree. It's time we asked John Miller to officially join our team. He's shown us more than we could have ever learned in a classroom. He's earned his place here with us, not just as a mentor, but as an equal. We need him." Mitch looked around at the others, who nodded in agreement. "He's not just a veteran, Mitch said. He's family, and we've learned enough from him to know that we can be better together. The rest of the team shared the same sentiment. It was time. They couldn't just admire him from afar anymore. They needed him to be a part of their journey, as a brother and a teammate. They knew he would never ask for it, but they also knew that it was the right thing to do. So, they set out to find John Miller again, this time with a clear purpose. They found him in his usual spot, the same place where they had first encountered him. He was sitting on a bench, cleaning his rifle, his hands moving with the same quiet precision that had once captivated them. He looked up as they approached, his expression unreadable. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice steady, but not unkind. Grant stepped forward, his heart beating a little faster. "Sir," he began, his voice respectful, "we've come to ask you something. We want you to join our team, not just as a mentor, but as a brother. You've taught us more than we ever could have learned on our own. We owe it to you, and to ourselves, to make this official." John Miller didn't immediately respond. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze penetrating. For a long moment, the silence was thick with tension, but then, finally, he spoke. "You've learned well," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You've earned my respect, and you've earned each other's. But I'll tell you this isn't about me. It's about you. You've got to keep learning, keep growing. And you've got to keep earning that respect every day." The words hit hard, but they knew he was right. They understood now that respect was something that had to be earned, day in and day out. It wasn't a one-time thing, it was a way of life. After a long pause, John Miller stood up slowly, his movements deliberate but strong. "I've been waiting for you to ask," he said quietly. "You've all proven you're ready. Let's get to work." The team stood there, in awe, as John Miller stepped forward, joining them. It wasn't just a moment of victory, it was a new beginning. From that day on, they were no longer just a group of soldiers. They were a brotherhood, united by their shared values, their respect for each other, and the lessons they had learned from the greatest mentor they could have ever hoped for. The following weeks were a turning point for the team. With John Miller now officially part of their unit, the bond they shared grew even stronger. The lessons they had learned from him weren't just about combat, they were about life. They had seen firsthand what it meant to be selfless, to put others above yourself, and to live with honor every single day. John Miller was no longer just a mentor. He was family. The team knew that they were ready for whatever came next, but they also understood that with each challenge, they would be tested not just as soldiers, but as men. Their next mission came quickly, a high-risk operation in a foreign country. Intelligence suggested that a terrorist group had seized control of a small village, holding civilians hostage. The team was tasked with rescuing them, but there were complications. The mission was delicate, and there was a risk of civilian casualties if they weren't careful. As the team prepared for the mission, Grant found himself standing next to John Miller, looking over the briefing. "This one's different," Grant said, his voice low. "We've got to be careful. It's not just about taking out targets. We have to save those people, too." Miller nodded, his gaze fixed on the map. "You're right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is about more than just the job. It's about the lives we're responsible for. You've learned well, Grant. But remember, sometimes the hardest thing to do is the right thing." Grant looked at Miller, the weight of his words sinking in. He had heard those words before, but now, with the experience they had all gained, they meant something more. It wasn't just about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about doing what was necessary, no matter the cost. The team launched their mission in the dead of night, under the cover of darkness. They moved silently through the terrain, their movements precise and coordinated. As they approached the village, they could hear the sounds of gunfire in the distance. The enemy was on high alert. They had to act fast. Grant and Miller led the way, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of movement. They reached the outskirts of the village and began to position themselves for the attack. The tension in the air was thick. They couldn't afford any mistakes. One wrong move, and the hostages could be caught in the crossfire. As the team made their way closer to the center of the village, they saw the enemy forces stationed along the streets, heavily armed and ready for a fight. The team split into smaller units, each taking a different approach to the target. They had a plan, and they had trained for this moment. But nothing ever goes exactly as planned. Just as they were about to breach the enemy's stronghold, a sudden alarm went off, and the enemy soldiers scrambled into position. they were spotted. The battle that ensued was intense, but the team moved with precision, their training and Miller's leadership guiding them every step of the way. The sounds of gunfire filled the air, but they kept moving forward, determined to save the hostages. Grant, Mitch, and the others worked as one, neutralizing the threat with deadly efficiency. Miller's calm presence at the front of the team was like a steady anchor in the chaos, keeping them focused on the mission. They finally reached the building where the hostages were being held. The enemy had fortified the area, but it didn't matter. They breached the door, moving swiftly to secure. The hostages. Stay down, Grant shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The hostages were scared, confused, but they trusted the soldiers who had come to save them. The team worked quickly, getting the civilians to safety as they continued to clear the building. It wasn't until the last hostage was safely out of harm's way that they could breathe a sigh of relief. The mission was a success. The hostages were safe, and the enemy forces were neutralized. But as they made their way back to the extraction point, Grant couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They hadn't just completed a mission, they had done it with honor. They had saved lives, just as John Miller had taught them to do. As they boarded the helicopter and flew back to base, Grant looked at Miller, who was sitting quietly, as always, but with a small nod of approval. The team had done it. They had lived up to the lessons they had learned, and in doing so, they had become the kind of soldiers they had always aspired to be. The helicopter lifted off, and as the base grew smaller beneath them, Grant realized that this mission had been more than just a victory. It had been a confirmation of everything they had learned. They had walked away from this with something far greater than a successful operation. They had walked away with the knowledge that they could be better, not just as soldiers, but as men. And that, he realized, was the greatest victory of all. As the team returned to base, the success of their latest mission lingered in their minds. But so did something else, a sense of urgency. They were no longer just soldiers carrying out orders. They had grown into something greater, something more than they had ever expected. With John Miller now fully integrated into their unit, they were all beginning to understand the weight of the lessons he had passed down. The team had been through missions before, but this time, the sense of duty and the understanding of what it meant to be part of something larger than themselves was clearer than ever. They had saved lives in the field, but now they were facing a different challenge. They had to continue to prove that the respect they had gained wasn't just for their skills, but for their integrity, their willingness to stand by each other no matter what. John Miller had shown them the value of silence, of listening more than speaking. He had taught them that sometimes, the greatest strength a soldier can have is the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult, even when it's not popular. And that's exactly what Grant and the team were prepared to do. It was a week after their last mission when the next assignment came in. This time, it was different. It wasn't a rescue operation or a counter-terrorism mission. It was a peacekeeping task, a delicate operation that would require not just military precision, but also a sense of diplomacy. A conflict had erupted between two factions in a small region abroad, and there were civilians caught in the middle. The mission was clear: stop the violence, protect the innocent, and ensure that both sides were brought to the negotiating table. But it wasn't going to be easy. There were risks of escalating tensions, and any wrong move could lead to more bloodshed. Grant and the team gathered in the briefing room, John Miller among them. The commanding officer explained the mission with urgency, but also with a sense of caution. This isn't just about force. This is about understanding, patience, and trust. You're going into a volatile situation. We're not there to fight. We're there to stabilize, to create a safe environment for dialogue to happen. Grant exchanged a look with Mitch and the others. They had always been trained to fight, to react quickly, to eliminate threats. But this mission was different. You've all learned what it means to be a soldier. Now, you're going to learn what it means to be diplomats, the commanding officer continued. John Miller remained quiet as always, his face unreadable. But Grant could tell that he was processing the same weight of the task. This wasn't about fighting. It was about maintaining peace, about understanding the situation without jumping to conclusions. After the briefing, the team assembled their gear. The operation was set for the next morning. Grant found himself deep in thought as he prepared his gear. This mission felt different, and he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them here. From the cocky recruits they had once been, to the soldiers they had become, it felt like they were about to enter a new chapter. And John Miller's presence was a constant reminder of what it meant to truly lead, not just through force, but through wisdom, through calm, and through understanding. The next day, they touched down in the region, the heat of the sun hitting them as they stepped out of the aircraft. The situation on the ground was tense. There were refugees scattered along the streets, and the air was thick with the sounds of distant gunfire. But Grant and the team weren't there to engage. Their mission was clear: secure the area, protect the civilians, and create the conditions necessary for peace talks to begin. They moved through the village, taking positions along key areas, setting up security points, and speaking with local leaders. Grant and John Miller took the lead, their experience guiding them through the most sensitive interactions. At one point, as they spoke with a local elder, the man looked at Miller and nodded. "You're one of the few who understands," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the years. "The others, they come with weapons. You come with respect." The words hit Grant hard. It was true. They weren't there to force anything on anyone. They were there to listen, to offer security, and to ensure that peace could be achieved without violence. The rest of the team followed suit, each member taking on their role with quiet determination. They weren't trying to be heroes. They were trying to be something better. Days passed as the team worked tirelessly, managing the tense environment and facilitating the dialogue between the two factions. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when it seemed like the talks might fall apart. But Grant and the others knew that they couldn't give up. They had learned the hard way that peace was not something that could be forced. It had to be earned through understanding, patience, and respect. Finally, after days of negotiation, the two sides reached an agreement. The violence ceased, and a fragile peace was established. It wasn't perfect, and the road ahead would be long, but it was a start. As they prepared to leave, Grant looked over at John Miller. The old man hadn't said much throughout the mission, but Grant knew that his influence had been felt in every decision they made. They hadn't just completed a mission, they had lived up to the values that John Miller had shown them: respect, honor, and integrity. As the team boarded the helicopter and flew back to base, Grant felt a sense of pride unlike any he had ever known. They had done it, not with force, but with wisdom. And it was all because of the lessons they had learned from a man who had walked among them, showing them the true meaning of strength. The weeks following their peacekeeping mission were some of the most transformative for Grant and his team. The lessons they had learned were still fresh in their minds, but now they were faced with a new challenge, one that would test everything they had gained, from the battlefield to the diplomatic table. It came in the form of a high-stakes operation that would take them into the heart of an ongoing conflict, this time with a direct enemy, a formidable terrorist organization that had been destabilizing the region. Their mission was clear: eliminate the threat. But there was an added layer to it, one that made this mission more personal than any they had faced before. Intelligence had confirmed that the leader of the terrorist group was someone from John Miller's past, a man who had once fought alongside him in an operation that had gone terribly wrong. Miller had never spoken much about his past, but the team now understood that his silence was not born of shame. It was born of respect for those who had paid the ultimate price. It was a bond that ran deeper than words, a bond that would lead them into this mission with more than just the usual stakes. As the mission briefing unfolded, Grant stood at the front of the room, looking at the faces of his team, now seasoned by the experiences they had shared. They were no longer the same group of young, idealistic soldiers who had entered basic training months ago. They had grown. They had become a true team, one forged not only in combat, but in the lessons taught by John Miller. "This mission is not just about eliminating a threat," Grant said, his voice firm. "It's about something deeper. This is personal for Miller, and it's personal for us. We've learned that sometimes the hardest missions are the ones that aren't about victory, but about closure. This man, the leader of this terrorist group, has a history with Miller. We owe it to him and to those who fought and died with him to finish what was started." The room was silent, the weight of Grant's words settling on everyone. There was no bravado, no jokes. They all understood the gravity of the task ahead. They were going in not only to neutralize a threat, but to honor a legacy that John Miller had carried with him, silently, for years. The next day, they were airborne, heading toward the target location. The mission was risky. There was intelligence suggesting that the leader of the group had taken refuge in a heavily fortified compound, surrounded by loyal militants and civilians. The team's primary objective was clear: eliminate the target and neutralize the threat, but they also had to minimize collateral damage. As the helicopter flew low over the rugged terrain, Grant's mind raced. They had trained for every scenario, but this one felt different. This wasn't just a mission. This was about honoring a man who had become a mentor and a friend. It was about proving to themselves that they could live up to the standards Miller had set for them. When they touched down on the outskirts of the compound, they moved swiftly into position. The plan was tight, the execution flawless. They breached the compound's perimeter, moving in with quiet precision. But as they got closer to their target, they realized that something was wrong. The compound was too quiet. There was no movement, no sound, nothing. They breached the front gate, the team fanning out to clear the area, but still, there was an eerie silence. Then, without warning, gunfire erupted from the shadows. It was an ambush, and the enemy had been waiting for them. The team reacted instantly, moving as one, covering each other's backs as they fought through the compound. The sound of gunfire rang through the air, but Grant felt the calmness of their training take over. There was no panic, no hesitation. They had learned from the best. They fought with precision, neutralizing the threat and pushing deeper into the compound. They were close now, closer than ever to their target. As they reached the building where the leader was hiding, Grant could see the tension in Miller's face. This was personal for him, but Grant knew that Miller wouldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment. They breached the door and entered, their weapons raised, ready for anything. And then, there he was, the leader, standing in front of them, a man who had once been a comrade to Miller. The room was silent as the two men locked eyes. For a moment, everything else faded away. Grant watched as Miller slowly raised his weapon, but then, he hesitated. The man before them was no longer the enemy in Miller's mind. He was a man who had once fought beside him, who had shared the same hardships and scars. The weight of the moment hung in the air, and Grant realized that this wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for closure, for redemption, and for the past that Miller had carried in silence for so long. But there was no time to dwell on it. The mission had to be completed. With a single, swift motion, Miller took the shot, ending the threat once and for all. As the team cleared the compound and made their way back to the extraction point, Grant couldn't help but feel the enormity of what they had just done. They had completed their mission, but in a way, they had also helped Miller close a chapter of his life that had remained open for far too long. As the helicopter lifted off, the team sat in silence, each of them reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. They had learned what it meant to be soldiers, yes, but more importantly, they had learned what it meant to be men of honor. And as they flew back to base, Grant knew that they would carry the lessons they had learned from Miller with them forever. The team returned to base after their final mission with John Miller, their spirits high, but their hearts weighed down with a sense of finality. They had been through so much together, not just as soldiers, but as brothers. And now, after everything they had learned, everything they had experienced, they found themselves at the edge of something new. John Miller had become a part of their team, not just as a mentor, but as an equal, a brother in arms. And now, as they walked back to their quarters, the realization settled in that this chapter of their journey had come to an end. Grant stood outside, gazing at the quiet base under the dimming sky. The events of the past few months had reshaped him. The cocky, naive soldier he had once been was no more. He had learned that true strength came from humility, from the quiet resolve to do what was right, no matter the cost. He had learned the meaning of sacrifice, of honor, and most importantly, of the bonds that held them all together. He wasn't the same man who had first walked through the doors of the base. They all had changed, but it was John Miller who had shown them the way. What now? Mitch's voice broke through Grant's thoughts. Grant turned to find the rest of the team gathered around him. They had all felt it, the shift that had taken place within them. It wasn't just about the missions anymore. It was about something deeper. We keep moving forward, Grant said, his voice firm, but filled with purpose. We keep learning. We keep growing. We carry on the lessons Miller taught us. And we do it together. The team nodded, their faces a mixture of respect and understanding. They knew that their journey was far from over. There would always be new challenges, new missions, but they had learned the most important lesson of all, that it was not just about the victories or the accolades, but about the integrity with which they lived their lives. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the base, the team gathered for one last time that day. John Miller was with them, as always, but there was something different in the air. The team had become what he had always hoped for. A group of men who understood what it meant to lead, not through force, but through wisdom, humility, and respect. They sat around a fire, the flickering flames casting shadows on their faces as they shared their thoughts, their hopes for the future. "You all did well," Miller said, his voice steady, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "But remember, this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. The lessons you've learned here will shape you for the rest of your lives. But it's up to you how you apply them." Grant looked at Miller, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you, sir, for everything, for showing us what it means to be a man of honor." Miller smiled, a rare, fleeting expression of warmth crossing his face. "You don't need to thank me. You've earned it. You've learned the hard way, but now you're ready. Ready for whatever comes next." The team sat in silence for a moment, each of them reflecting on what had been said. They knew they had grown, but they also knew they still had a long road ahead of them. A road that would challenge them in ways they hadn't even begun to imagine. But no matter what came next, they would face it together, as a family, as brothers. Grant's mind raced with the possibilities, but he felt a sense of calm settle over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: they were ready. They had learned from the best, and now they would carry those lessons with them, wherever they went. The fire burned low as the night grew darker, but the team remained seated, talking quietly among themselves. There was no need for grand speeches or promises. They had already made their commitment, to each other, to their mission, and to the lessons they had learned from a man who had shown them what it meant to be truly great. As the fire faded, Grant stood up, looking around at his team. They had come a long way, and now they were ready for whatever came next. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but it didn't matter. They were a team, and with Miller by their side, they could face anything. Together. In this emotional story, follow the journey of a group of elite soldiers who, through their experiences, come to understand the true meaning of honor, sacrifice, and respect. As they embark on dangerous missions, they are guided by the wisdom and integrity of an unexpected mentor, John Miller, a man whose past is shrouded in mystery. Throughout their challenges, the soldiers learn more than just tactical skills. They learn what it truly means to be a soldier, a leader, and a man of honor. This emotional story highlights the bonds that form when respect is earned through action and sacrifice. It's a powerful reminder that the greatest heroes are often the ones who live in the shadows, doing what's right without seeking recognition. With each mission, the soldiers grow, and the lessons they learn from Miller shape their futures. In this emotional story, you will witness their transformation from naive recruits to men of integrity, ready to face whatever comes next, knowing they've learned from the best. Their story is a testament to the power of mentorship, respect, and the unspoken lessons that define true heroism. This emotional story not only captivates with its action-packed missions, but also resonates with anyone who values personal growth, honor, and the quiet strength that comes from within. This is more than just a tale of war. It's a story of the heart, one that will leave you reflecting on your own journey and the heroes who have shaped your path.